The day I lost my job, my parents erased me like a typo, and then years later they showed up begging because their lights were off and Brandon had wrecked their finances. I'm Kendra, and what I found in my own bank records will make you furious. Stay with me. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type interested in the comments. And I will give you a heart. I'm going to start where it actually snapped because the context is always used to excuse what people did to me later. I had $3 and some change in my account. My landlord had just taped a reminder note on my door like I was a child, and my mother was still posting smiling family dinner photos like her daughter wasn't eating instant noodles in a rented room the size of a closet. I'm Kendra, and the week I lost my job, my family didn't just stop helping, they stopped acknowledging I existed, like I was a bad smell they could pretend wasn't in the house. It happened fast too, which is how you know it wasn't an accident. I got called into HR on a Tuesday. They used that soft voice people use when they're about to cut your life in half, and my manager wouldn't meet my eyes. "We're restructuring," she said, hands folded, and then she slid the folder toward me like it was a gift. I remember staring at the paper thinking, this is it. This is the moment people always talk about, the moment family steps in and says, "We've got you." I didn't even want money. I wanted the simplest thing on earth, to not feel alone inside my own skin. I drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, and before I even pulled into my parking lot, my phone buzzed. It was my dad. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Come over." Just, "Heard you got let go. Give it a few days. Don't panic." Like I was a misbehaving employee in his life, not his daughter. I called him back immediately. "Dad, I'm scared," I said, and I hated the way my voice cracked because I could already hear the judgment forming on the other end. He exhaled like I was annoying him. "Kendra, you're an adult. Figure it out. Your brother figured it out." That right there, that line, was the knife. Because Brandon didn't figure it out. Brandon got his car down payment covered. Brandon got his rent floated twice. Brandon got his late fees magically handled. Brandon got applause for breathing. And I got told to figure it out like suffering was a character-building hobby. I called my mom next because part of me still believed she'd be the soft landing even if my dad was cold. She answered on the second ring, cheerful, like she was performing happiness. "Hi, honey," I said. "Mom, I lost my job." And she paused, just long enough for me to hear a TV in the background and the clink of a spoon in a mug, like she had a full life happening while mine was falling apart. "Oh," she said, and then, "Maybe this is a sign you needed a reset. You've been so stressed." I said, "Can I come over tonight? I need to be around family." And she hit me with the sentence that still makes my jaw tighten. "Let's not make this a big thing. You'll spiral. Give it time. You'll spiral." Translation: your pain is inconvenient. Your fear is embarrassing. Your crisis is not allowed to touch our normal. And then she said, "We're having dinner with Brandon and his girlfriend tonight anyway, so it's not a good time. Not a good time to let your daughter sit at the table and breathe." That's what she meant. So I didn't go over. I sat in my apartment with the lights off to save electricity and opened my laptop to apply for jobs like my life depended on it, because it did. And here's what nobody tells you. Unemployment isn't just bills, it's a slow, daily humiliation. It's waking up with your stomach tight. It's sending applications until your eyes blur. It's forcing your voice to sound confident on interviews while your brain screams, "Please don't reject me again." Rejections don't even come with full sentences. We went with other candidates. We've decided to move forward. It's like being dumped by robots. And every time I wanted to text my mom, just one message like, "I'm not okay today," I remembered "you'll spiral," and I swallowed it. I learned to eat cheap. Rice, eggs, those little ramen packets that taste like salt and regret. I learned to take long walks because walking is free and it gives you the illusion you're going somewhere. I moved out of my apartment by the end of that month because I couldn't keep up. I rented a room from a woman I met through a listing with a blurry photo and a quiet house only warning. The room was so small my suitcase had to live under my bed. The walls were thin enough that I could hear strangers laughing in the kitchen at night, and it felt like the universe was mocking me. Other people still had community, while I had silence. And the wild part is my family didn't check on me once. Not a, did you eat? Not a, are you safe? Not even a fake thinking of you. They just kept living, and I watched it through their social media posts like a ghost watching the living from behind glass. Sunday dinner photos. Holiday decorations. Brandon holding up some new gadget with my dad's proud grin beside him. My mom captioning everything with blessed. If you've ever been cut off emotionally, you know how it feels. It's like your relationship was a contract and they ripped it up the moment you stopped being useful. And here's where it gets uglier. I had been useful for years. I was the quiet fixer, the dependable one. The one who picked up prescriptions, handled little errands, paid small, temporary bills when they were short, and transferred money without asking questions because I thought love meant being easy. And when I became the one in trouble, suddenly I was drama. Suddenly I was unstable. Suddenly I needed space. Space from what, exactly? From being seen struggling? From making them feel guilty? Because that's the thing. Some families don't abandon you because they hate you. They abandon you because your pain threatens their self-image. If they admit you're suffering, they have to admit they're the kind of parents who let their kids suffer. So they rewrite you as difficult and call it peace. Now let me ask you something right here because I want you in this with me. Where are you watching from right now and what time is it there? Drop your city and time in the comments because I swear I read those and it reminds me there are real humans on the other side of the screen. And also tell me this too, if you lost everything tomorrow, would your family check on you or would they give you space the way mine did? Because that phrase, give you space, became their favorite blanket. Anytime I tried to reach out, it was, we're giving you space to figure it out. Like I was a broken appliance they didn't want to deal with. One night, about 6 weeks into this mess, my phone lit up with a group chat notification. Family chat. I hadn't been in it, not really, but somehow my number was still there. It was a photo of dinner at my parents' place. Big table. Everyone smiling. My mom had made her famous chicken. Brandon was in the center, like he was the guest of honor. My aunt commented, "So nice to have everyone together." Everyone. Not me. I stared at that photo so long my eyes started burning. And this is where the thoughts got ugly, the kind you don't say out loud, the kind that make you feel ashamed, but I'm going to say it because you've probably had them too. I wanted something to happen to them, not like harm, but like a moment of fear. A moment where they felt what it was like to be left. I wanted them to wake up and realize I was gone, and then feel that cold, hollow space I'd been living in. Then I hated myself for thinking that, because I'm not a monster. I just wanted justice. So I did the only thing I could do. I survived quietly, and I started tracking everything. It began as a coping mechanism. If I couldn't control their love, I could control facts. I opened my bank app and scrolled back, month by month, and my stomach started turning because I realized I hadn't just been helping here and there. I'd been subsidizing their comfort. Utilities. Groceries. Brandon's course fees. Emergency. Transfers that were never returned. Car repairs that somehow became my problem. I pulled statements, screenshots, confirmations. And I didn't just save them. I organized them. I made folders with dates and labels like I was building a case file, because I was. It's funny how your brain changes when you stop begging for affection and start collecting evidence. I wasn't even fully angry yet. I was stunned. Like, wait, all those times I couldn't buy myself something small, all those times I said no to my own plans, I wasn't being responsible. I was being used. And it didn't hit me in one dramatic explosion. It hit me like drip water torture. One transfer at a time. Another $200. Another $150. Another just this once. And you know what the total did to me? It didn't make me feel powerful immediately. It made me feel sick. Because it meant I had funded the very people who abandoned me the second I needed warmth. There was one payment that really got me. It was a transfer to Brandon labeled cert exam. I remembered that week. Brandon had called me, voice desperate. Sis, if I don't pay this, I lose my spot. I'd sent it. I'd skipped groceries and made it work. And that same Brandon hadn't sent me a single message when I lost my job. Not one. Not even a lazy dang. So, I printed everything. Not because I planned to sue anyone. Not because I wanted revenge. But because I needed a mirror. I needed proof for myself that I wasn't imagining the imbalance. That I wasn't crazy. That it wasn't all in my head like my mom loves to say when she doesn't want to deal with consequences. And the moment I saw the pile of paper on my kitchen table, I realized I had been living inside their story for years. In their story, Brandon was the bright star, and I was the background support. In their story, my sacrifices didn't exist because acknowledging them would mean admitting they were unfair. But on paper, on cold, unarguable paper, I existed. I mattered. My work mattered. My money mattered. And for the first time since losing my job, I felt something that wasn't fear. I felt strategy. Because if my family's love was conditional, then so was my support. And I knew exactly how this would play out when I stopped being their invisible safety net. They would act confused. They would act offended. They would call me selfish. They would pretend they had no idea. And then the real test would come when they needed me again, because families like mine always need you again. They don't miss you when you're gone. They miss what you provided. I didn't know when the call would come, but I knew it was coming because I'd seen Brandon's spending habits, my parents' denial, the way they live like consequences are for other people. And sitting there with those receipts, I made a promise that scared me and thrilled me at the same time. The next time they reached out, I wasn't going to answer as the obedient daughter. I was going to answer as the person who finally saw the whole game board, and I was going to make them say the quiet part out loud. The call came on a Wednesday at 7:12 a.m., and I remember the time because I was staring at my phone like it was a bomb, and I was deciding whether to cut the red wire or the blue one. And when I saw Mom on the screen, my first thought wasn't love or relief. It was suspicion, because families like mine don't check on you when you're drowning. They check on you when they need a lifeguard. I let it ring twice on purpose just to see if she'd hang up like it was never important. And then I answered with a calm voice I did not feel and said, "Hey." My mom didn't say hello, didn't ask how I was, didn't even pretend. She went straight into performance mode, that breathy urgency people use when they want you to panic with them. "Kendra, are you sitting down?" she asked, and I almost laughed because that line is always followed by either tragedy or manipulation, and in my family those two things hold hands. I said, "I'm sitting." She exhaled dramatically. "Your father's bank account is locked." There it was. Not, "I miss you." Not, "We were wrong." Just a crisis with my name written underneath it. I said, "Why is it locked?" And I kept my voice flat because I've learned if you sound emotional, they treat you like your logic is optional. She said, "We don't know. The bank won't tell us everything. They said something about unusual activity, and then Brandon tried to pay for something and his card declined too. And your dad has to pay the property tax by Friday, and we can't access the funds." Notice how fast she slid Brandon into it, like he was attached to their finances like a parasite with a college degree. I stared at the wall in my rented room, the same wall I'd stared at while my stomach growled, and my brain did this weird thing where it tried to feel sorry for her, like reflex sympathy, and then another part of me spoke up and said, "Hold on. Where was this urgency when you watched me disappear? So, I asked the question that mattered. Okay, I said. What do you need from me? My mom hesitated, and that hesitation was the tell, because when they hesitate it means they know they're wrong, but they're hoping you'll volunteer anyway, so they don't have to say it. We just need a little bridge, she said, soft and careful, like she was asking me to borrow sugar, just until the bank clears it up. A bridge. My favorite word in family manipulation. A bridge is always built out of your money and your silence. I said, how much is a little bridge? And she got offended immediately, because asking for numbers is what breaks their spell. Kendra, she said, don't do that. I said, don't do what? She snapped. Make it sound like we're using you. And I almost choked because the audacity was so loud it felt like it had its own microphone. I said, then say the number. She lowered her voice like the walls had ears. 2,000. Then she added quickly, and Brandon needs 500 for his car insurance, but that's separate. Separate. Like the same hand wasn't reaching into the same pocket. I didn't answer right away. I opened my banking app. I looked at my balance. It wasn't pretty. It was the kind of balance that looks like a typo. And here's the part that made me feel something sharp and clean. I could have sent it. I could have panicked and sent it and then eaten noodles again and called it love. But my hands didn't move. They stayed still. Because while she was talking, I saw the printed stack of receipts sitting on my dresser like a witness. I saw the labels I'd made. I saw my own handwriting. And I remembered Brandon's silence. So, I asked another question. Mom, I said, do you know where I live? She sounded irritated. Why would I know that? You've been figuring things out. The way she said it, like figuring things out was a contagious disease. I said, right. So you don't know where I live. You don't know if I'm safe. You don't know if I'm eating. You don't know if I'm okay. But you know exactly how to call me at 7:12 a.m. when you need money. There was a long silence. I could hear her breathing, and then I heard her tone shift into that cold parent voice that's meant to put you back in your place. Kendra, she said, we're family. And I said, family is not a debit card. She scoffed, like I'd just said something offensive. So you're going to punish us? She asked. Punish. That's how they frame boundaries, like you're the villain for refusing to keep funding their disrespect. I said, no, I'm going to protect myself. I'm not doing transfers anymore. She went quiet again, and then her voice sharpened. This is Brandon's fault, isn't it? You're jealous. Jealous. Another classic. Reduce your pain to envy, so they don't have to face the actual truth. I said, no, Mom. I'm not jealous. I'm exhausted. I've been supporting this house financially while being treated like a problem emotionally, and I'm done. She tried to laugh, but it sounded brittle. Supporting? You're being dramatic. That word, dramatic, is how they erase your reality. So I walked her into the trap calmly. Do you want to see the receipts? I asked. She said, what receipts? Like she genuinely couldn't imagine I'd kept records, because people who use you don't expect you to remember. I said, every payment, every transfer, every bill I covered, just this once. I have all of it. She didn't speak for a second, and then she went straight into denial. Kendra, you offered those. I said, I offered because you trained me to think love equals sacrifice and silence. I'm untrained now. She got angry. You could hear it in her breathing. So, you're going to let your father lose the house? She hissed. Let your father lose the house. Notice how she made it my responsibility again. I said, if the house is that fragile, then the truth is you were never safe. You were just standing on my back. And then she did something that actually made my stomach flip because it was so transparent. She started crying. Not quiet crying. Performative crying. The kind that comes with sniffing and pauses and, "I can't believe my own daughter is doing this to me." I didn't interrupt. I just waited, because if you interrupt a manipulator's tears, they accuse you of cruelty. Let them finish the scene. When she finally paused for breath, I said, "Mom, you didn't call me for 6 weeks. You didn't check if I was eating. You didn't ask if I was okay. You didn't ask if I needed a ride to an interview. You didn't ask anything. So don't cry like I'm the one breaking the family." The crying stopped instantly, like someone turned off a faucet, and that right there told me everything. She wasn't sad. She was frustrated that the trick wasn't working. Her voice turned icy.
"Fine," she said.
"If that's how you want to be." I said, "This is how I need to be." She snapped, "Don't expect us to be there for you when you fail again." And I smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was finally honest. "You weren't there when I failed the first time," I said. "So nothing changes." Then she hung up. No goodbye. No love you. Just a click. And the room got quiet, but it wasn't the old lonely quiet. It was the quiet you get after you close a door that's been letting cold air in for years. My hands were shaking, and I hated that they were shaking because I wasn't scared of losing them. I was scared of the guilt they'd planted in me like a parasite. I stood up, walked to the sink, turned on cold water, and held my wrists under it like I was resetting my nervous system. Then my phone buzzed again. Brandon. I stared at his name like it was a dare. I answered because I wanted to hear how he'd spin it. "Yo," he said, casual, like we were friends. "Mom said you're being weird." Being weird. Translation: You're not complying. I said, "I'm not sending money." He laughed like I was joking. "Come on, sis," he said. "It's just a loan." I said, "You've never paid me back once." He got quiet for a beat, then went defensive. "Because you never asked." I said, "That's the point. You counted on me not asking." He tried the guilt angle next because that's their shared language. "Dad's stressing," he said. "You really want to do this right now?" I said, "I didn't choose the timing. You did when you ignored me while I was drowning." He snapped, "You always make it about you." And I said, "It is about me. It's my money." He scoffed, and then he said the line that made my blood go hot. "You think you're better than us now because you printed some papers?" Printed some papers. Like my years of sacrifice for arts and crafts. I said, "No, Brandon. I think you're comfortable because I've been funding your comfort. There's a difference." He got angry. "So, what, you're going to expose us?" he said, and the way his voice tightened on expose told me he already knew what was coming. I didn't answer directly. I let silence do what it does best. He filled it fast. "Don't be petty," he said.
Petty.
Another word they use to make you feel small for having a spine. I said, "If telling the truth makes me petty, then maybe the problem is what you've been doing in the dark." He breathed hard into the phone, and then he lowered his voice like he was about to threaten me without sounding like a villain. "Just think about what you're doing," he said. "You're going to ruin the family." And I said, "No, Brandon. The family was ruined the day you all decided I only mattered when I paid." Then he hung up too. And I stood there, alone in that tiny room, with my phone in my hand and my heart pounding like I'd run a mile, and I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. They didn't fear losing me. They feared losing access to me. And then my phone buzzed again, this time with a notification that made my stomach drop because it wasn't a call. It was an email from my dad's bank with my name on it, and the subject line looked like something you only see when someone has been moving money around without permission, and in that moment I understood why the account was locked, and why they needed a bridge, and why my mom sounded panicked. Because it wasn't just a mistake, it was a cover-up, and the next thing I did was open the email and see a detail that connected me to their mess in a way I did not consent to. I opened the email, and my eyes went straight to the line that said "New payee added," and then right underneath it, like a slap after a smile, "Scheduled transfer pending," and then the part that made my throat go dry. Reference: Kendra M. Walters. My full name, not the nickname my family uses when they want something, my legal name, the one tied to my identity, my credit, my life. And for a second my brain tried to pretend it was a glitch, because sometimes your mind protects you by offering denial like a blanket. But then I scrolled and I saw the last 4 digits of an account number I recognized, not because I had it memorized, but because I had once stared at it while setting up my own rent payment. And suddenly the room felt too small, like the air had been stolen and replaced with electricity. I sat down hard on the edge of my bed, laptop balanced on my knees, and I read it again slowly, forcing my eyes to stop skipping like a frightened animal. Payee, Walters Property Holdings, LLC. That wasn't even real. That was my dad's favorite kind of fake, the kind that sounds official enough to make people stop asking questions. And then, the scheduled transfer amount, $3,500. Not $2,000. Not a little bridge. $3,500, scheduled to move out of an account I wasn't even supposed to be connected to anymore, and tied to my name like I had authorized it, like I had agreed. Like I had been sitting at a kitchen table somewhere nodding politely while they built a trap around me. I felt my hands go cold, and then I felt something hotter rise up behind my ribs, because this wasn't family needs help. This was family is using my identity as a tool. I pulled up my credit monitoring app instantly, not because I'm paranoid, because I learned the hard way that calm people get robbed quietly. My score was still there. But there was a new alert that hadn't been there yesterday. Inquiry. Home lending pre-approval. My stomach flipped so hard, I actually stood up like I was about to run, like movement could undo what was already happening. I clicked into the details and the lender name popped up, local, small, one of those places that says, "We treat you like family," which is exactly the kind of place my parents would use because familiarity is a disguise. I wasn't imagining it. They didn't just need a bridge. They were trying to build an entire road over my name. I called the bank immediately, and the automated system greeted me like we were friends, and I wanted to scream at a robot, but instead I did what I always do when I'm scared. I got precise. I said fraud at the prompt so fast it sounded like one word, and I waited, and when the representative finally answered, I gave her my information and told her, "There is a scheduled transfer referencing my name that I did not authorize, and there is a payee added that I did not add." Her tone shifted instantly, that professional seriousness that means you're no longer a regular customer, you're a case number. She asked me to verify the email details, and I read them out, and then she said something that made my skin crawl. "Ma'am, it appears the transfer was initiated using credentials associated with an authorized user profile." Authorized user. That phrase is a knife when you didn't authorize anything. I said, "I'm not an authorized user on my father's account." She paused, clicking keys, and then she said, "The profile on file uses your name, your date of birth, and a contact number that ends in 4412. That was my mother's number. I went completely still. Do you know how sick it is to hear someone else's phone number attached to your identity like a parasite? I said, "Freeze it.
Lock it.
Stop the transfer." She said, "We can place an immediate hold and flag the account for fraud investigation, but we'll need you to file an identity theft report to fully detach your name from the profile." I said, "Do it. Right now." She asked if I knew who created the profile. I didn't even hesitate. "My parents," I said. Saying it out loud felt like swallowing glass, because admitting your parents would do this is like admitting the floor in your childhood home was never real. She didn't react emotionally. She just said, "Understood," like she's heard this story before, which honestly made me feel worse, because it meant I wasn't special. It meant this kind of betrayal was common. When we ended the call, I sat there staring at my phone, and my brain replayed my mother's voice from earlier, the way she'd said, "Don't make it sound like we're using you." And now I could see it clearly. She wasn't worried about being used. She was worried about being caught. I called my dad next, not because I thought he'd tell the truth, because I wanted to hear how he lied when cornered. He answered on the second ring like he'd been waiting, like they were monitoring my reactions the way predators monitor prey. "Kendra," he said, too calm, "your mother said you were upset." Upset. Like I was emotional over nothing. I said, "Did you open a lending inquiry in my name?" Silence. That beautiful, guilty silence where the lie hasn't arrived yet. Then he did what he always does. He sighed like I was the problem. "What are you talking about?" I said, "Don't do that. I have an inquiry alert, and your bank has my name tied to an authorized user profile using mom's number. There's a transfer scheduled for $3,500. Explain it." He laughed once, low and dismissive, like I was accusing him of stealing a candy bar. "You're being dramatic," he said. "Of course. Same script, different crime." I said, "Dad, this is identity theft." That word landed differently. I heard his breath change. I heard the calculation. "It's not theft," he snapped. "We're handling a situation." Handling. That cursed word again. I said, "So, you admit you did it?" He tried to pivot. "We needed access," he said, "because you wouldn't help, and your mother was panicking, and the house could be at risk." He said house like it was sacred, like it deserved protection more than my future. I said, "So you decided to risk my credit to protect your image?" He raised his voice. "Don't you dare talk to me like that." There it was. Not denial. Authority. The mask slipping. I said, "You attached my identity to your accounts. You don't get to play father now." Then he said the line that told me exactly who he was. "After everything we've done for you." I almost smiled because this is how they rewrite history in real time, like my childhood was a loan I'm supposed to repay with my adulthood. I said, "You cut me off when I lost my job. You didn't check on me. You erased me. And now you want to borrow my name." He got quiet again, and then his voice turned threatening without saying the word threat. "Be careful," he said. "You don't want to make this ugly." Ugly. Meaning consequences. Meaning exposure. Meaning other people finding out the respectable family is rotting inside. I said, "It's already ugly. You just want it quiet." He started to talk over me, so I did something that shocked even me. I hung up. No closure. No debate. Click. And then, because my nervous system was on fire, I did the one thing I should have done years ago. I stopped trying to win an argument and started building a case. I opened a folder on my laptop called Proof, and I saved everything. The email, the credit inquiry alert, screenshots of the bank communication. I wrote down times, dates, what was said. I recorded my next calls legally within my state guidelines because if you've ever been scapegoated, you learn that memory isn't enough. You need receipts that don't blink. Then I called my mom again, not to beg, but to bait the truth. She answered with fake softness. "Kendra, please don't do this," she said immediately. That alone told me my dad had already told her I knew. I said, "Do what?" She whispered, "Call the bank." So she knew. Of course she knew. I said, "Why is your phone number tied to my identity on Dad's account?" She started crying again, but her crying had a new texture now, sharper, desperate. "Your father was scared," she said. "We were scared. We didn't mean to." I said, "You don't accidentally open lending inquiries. You don't accidentally attach someone's identity to an account. This was a plan." She snapped, dropping the tears like a costume. So, what, you want us homeless? She hissed. And there it was again, the manipulation that pretends you're the aggressor while they're the victim. I said, I want you to stop committing crimes in my name. She went quiet, then tried one more angle, the most disgusting one. Brandon is going to suffer, she said softly, like that should melt me. I said, Brandon is a grown man. He can suffer. I suffered alone, and none of you cared. She said, that's not fair. I laughed, one short laugh, because fairness is a concept they only believe in when it benefits the golden child. I said, here's what's going to happen. The bank has flagged it. I'm filing an identity theft report. I'm freezing my credit. And if anything else shows up under my name, I'm going to the police. Her voice went flat, pure hate under a mother's mask. You would call the police on your own parents? And I said, you would steal from your own daughter. Silence. Heavy silence. Then she said, fine. Do what you want. And she hung up. My hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was adrenaline, the kind that comes when you realize you're not dealing with misunderstanding, you're dealing with entitlement. I froze my credit with all 3 bureaus that night. I filed the report. I sent the bank the documentation. And then, right when I thought the worst part was over, I got a text from Brandon that made my skin go cold because it wasn't angry, it was smug. You're really about to blow up the family over a misunderstanding? Dad said, he has something that proves you owe him. Owe him. My heart thumped once, hard, because I knew what that meant. They were about to flip the script and paint me as the thief, and if you've ever been the quiet one, you already know the most dangerous moment isn't when you discover the betrayal. It's when the people who betrayed you realize you're not staying silent anymore, and then they start pulling out whatever they've been saving to destroy your credibility. Brandon's text sat on my screen like a dare, and the thing about my family is they never fight fair. They fight like they're defending a kingdom, meaning they don't care what's true, they care what sticks. So when he said Dad had proof, I owed him. I didn't feel confused. I felt alert because I knew exactly what kind of proof they meant, the kind that looks official to outsiders, the kind that's missing context on purpose, the kind that takes every time I helped out and repackages it like a debt I agreed to pay forever. I didn't respond right away because I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of watching me scramble. Instead, I did what I've learned to do in survival mode. I slowed down and got deliberate. I opened a fresh notebook and wrote one sentence at the top like a headline. What are they about to accuse me of? And then I wrote beneath it the 3 most likely things, because families like mine recycle the same weapons. They would claim I stole from them by not sending money anymore. They would claim I used their house or their help as leverage, or they would claim I promised to cover something big and backed out. Then I went to my email search bar and typed my dad's name and the word loan, then agreement, then help. Then I pulled up old messages I'd ignored because they made me feel guilty, and I started reading them the way a lawyer reads them, not the way a daughter reads them. And there it was, little phrases sprinkled like poison. Just until you're back on your feet. We'll figure out repayment later. Don't worry about it now. Always vague. Always designed so they could rewrite it later, because vagueness is where manipulators live. It's the swamp they drag you into. My phone buzzed again. This time a call from Dad. He didn't usually call twice if I didn't answer, so I knew he was in that phase where intimidation replaces charm. I let it ring out, and then I sent a simple text. Put it in writing. I wanted a record. Within 30 seconds, he replied, and I could practically hear his teeth grinding through the screen. Come to the house tonight. We need to talk like adults. That made me laugh, because talk like adults in my family means come sit in the courtroom we built in our living room where we are judge and jury, and you are the defendant. I didn't agree to go, but I didn't refuse either because I needed to see what they had, and more importantly, I needed to see who else was involved. So I texted one more thing. I'm bringing a friend. And then I watched the typing bubble appear, disappear, appear again, and finally, No. Family only. That told me everything. They didn't want witnesses. They wanted control. I called Daniel, the one friend who doesn't do that nervous polite thing when people cross lines, the one who hears they're my parents and still says and they're wrong. And I said, I need you nearby tonight, not inside, just close. He didn't ask 10 questions. He said, send me the address and a time. I'll be parked around the corner. Then I printed my bank screenshots and credit inquiry alert and the email showing the payee and the scheduled transfer, because if they tried to gaslight me, I wanted the paper in my hand like a shield, something real, something that didn't change when they changed their story. I also printed the credit bureau freeze confirmations because I wanted them to know their access was cut, and I wanted to watch their faces when they realized the puppet strings were gone. At 6:40 p.m., I pulled into my parents' driveway, and the porch light was on even though it wasn't dark yet, like they wanted the house to look welcoming, like ambience could soften theft. I sat in my car for 10 seconds and breathed, and I'm going to tell you something honest, not pretty, but real. I wasn't scared of them physically. I was scared of becoming the old version of me, the one that apologizes in advance for existing, the one that folds to keep the peace, because that version of me was trained, and training doesn't vanish just because you wake up one day angry. I walked up, knocked once, and my mom opened the door immediately like she'd been waiting behind it, her face already set in that expression she uses for public tragedy, eyes wide, mouth tight, like she was the victim of my presence. Come in, she said, and she didn't hug me. Of course she didn't. Hugs are for the golden child. The living room was clean in a way that felt staged, pillows lined up, coffee table cleared, family photos angled toward the couch, and I noticed something that made my stomach twist, a framed photo of Brandon in his graduation cap front and center, like a reminder of who matters here. Dad was already seated in his chair, the one he always sits in when he wants to look like the authority, and Brandon was on the couch scrolling his phone like he was bored, which is a performance too. Boredom is how entitled people show dominance. There she is, Dad said, not warm, not cruel, just flat, like I was an employee who showed up late. I didn't sit. I set my folder on the coffee table and said, before you start, understand this. The bank flagged the transfer. My credit is frozen, and I filed an identity theft report. My mom's eyes flashed, not with guilt, with panic, because panic means consequences are real. Dad's jaw tightened. You filed a report, he said slowly, like he was tasting the word. Yes, I said. Because someone used my identity. Brandon finally looked up. You're really doing this, he said. Like I was the problem for reacting to harm. Dad leaned forward and slid a folder toward me. Thick, tabbed, too organized for a spontaneous conversation, which meant they'd been planning this longer than they admitted. You want proof, he said. Here. I opened it, and the first page was a spreadsheet with dates and amounts, every transfer I had ever sent to them highlighted in yellow like evidence, and next to it in bold, total support received, as if the money I had given them was money I had taken. I flipped the page and saw printed screenshots of messages, but the ones they chose, the ones that could be twisted, like the time I texted my mom, I'll handle it, when she said the electricity bill was overdue, and they had circled that phrase in red like it was a contract. My father pointed at it like a prosecutor. You said you would handle it, he said. You handled it for years, he continued, and then you stopped, and we had to step in. Because you became unreliable. Unreliable. That word hit me like a flashback because it's the word families like mine use when you stop being useful. I looked at Brandon and said, Did you know they used my identity? He shrugged, a tiny shrug, then said, I know you're overreacting. That's when I realized something important. Brandon didn't care if it was wrong. Brandon cared that the machine that benefits him was being interrupted. I pulled out my documents and placed them on top of my dad's folder, covering his evidence with real evidence. Here's what you did. I said, and I pointed to the bank email, and then I pointed to the credit inquiry alert, and then I pointed to the bank rep's note showing my mom's number attached to my identity profile. My mom's lips parted slightly, and for a second she looked like she might pretend she didn't understand. But she didn't, because she knew I had enough. Dad's voice sharpened. We were protecting this family, he said. From what? I asked. From paying your own bills? And then he did the thing I knew he would do. He shifted from defense to attack because when manipulators get cornered, they don't admit, they accuse. He tapped his folder again and said, You want to talk about theft, Kendra? Let's talk about the thousands you owe us for living in our house after college, the car insurance we covered, the phone bill, the groceries, and he started listing normal parental support like it was a loan shark ledger, and my mom nodded along like, yes, love has interest rates. My chest burned, but I kept my voice calm, because calm drives them crazy. So this is your move, I said. Rewrite parenting as debt, so you can justify identity theft. Dad's eyes went hard. Watch your mouth, he said. And then Brandon, of all people, leaned forward and said, Just drop it, okay, just drop it, and Dad will make it right. Make it right. Not apologize. Not undo. Make it right, meaning do some small fix as long as the story stays quiet. I looked at my mom and said, How did you have my information to attach to a profile? She didn't answer. She glanced at Dad. That glance told me something else too. She wasn't the mastermind. She was the accomplice, the enabler, who does the dirty work because she thinks it keeps her safe. I stood there and let the silence stretch, and then I said the sentence that changed the temperature in the room. If you don't tell me the full truth right now, I will request the lender's application file, and I will press charges. My dad's face flushed, and for a split second the mask slipped and I saw it. Fear, not fear of hurting me, fear of being exposed. And then he said, very quietly, You don't understand what you're doing. That sentence was loaded, like a threat wrapped in concern.
Explain it, I said.
My father stared at me and then, finally, he opened his mouth to say something I did not expect, something that made my stomach drop in a completely new way, because he wasn't about to confess to the fraud. He was about to reveal why they felt entitled to do it in the first place. And the first words out of his mouth were, That account you think is yours, it never really was. My dad saying, That account you think is yours, it never really was, hit me in the chest like someone yanked the floor out from under my feet, because if there's one thing parents like mine love more than control, it's rewriting reality and calling it family history. And I could feel my brain trying to protect me by going numb, but I forced myself to stay present because numb is where they win. Numb is where you start doubting your own memory, and they start building a new one on top of
yours.
Explain, I said, and my voice didn't shake, which surprised even me, because inside I felt like a wire pulled too tight. My mom's hands were folded in her lap, like she was in church, the pose she does when she wants to look innocent while someone else does the talking. Brandon leaned back again, back to bored, because he wasn't bored, he was confident. He believed whatever Dad said next would put me back in my place. Dad took a slow breath like he was preparing to deliver wisdom, not confession, and that's when you know someone has been practicing their speech. When you were 16, he said, we opened that account for you. For me, I repeated because I knew where this was going, the classic bait and switch. Gift becomes leash. We put money in, he continued. We helped you build credit. We guided you. He used the word guided like I was a toddler crossing a street, like I hadn't been the one paying their bills for years. And we kept it under control because you were young, he said, and because someone had to be responsible. I stared at him. So you're admitting it was mine, I said. He shook his head slowly. No, he said. We were custodians. Custodians. I almost laughed, Because custodians don't use your identity to open a mortgage, custodians don't move money around in secret, custodians don't threaten you when you ask questions, but I didn't laugh because I didn't want to give them an easy way to call me dramatic. Okay, I said. So show me the paperwork. Dad's eyes narrowed. Don't play smart, he snapped. And there it was, the real dad, not the calm authority, the bully who panics when the kid he trained stops flinching. I'm not playing anything, I said, and I slid my folder toward him. I have a fraud report number, and I have the bank linking Mom's phone to my profile. So if you're claiming you had custody of my account, then you just told me you had access, which means you can explain why my identity was used. My mom's face twitched, just once, like a crack in plaster. Brandon's jaw tightened. Dad didn't answer that directly. Of course he didn't. Instead, he did what manipulators do when they're cornered. He changed the subject to a larger moral story where he's the hero. You lost your job, he said, and you went unstable. Unstable. He said it like it was a medical diagnosis, not an insult. You stopped showing up, he continued. You stopped being reliable, and we had to make sure this family didn't collapse. That was rich, considering the only reason their life didn't collapse for years was because I quietly kept it propped up like a beam in a rotting house. I didn't go unstable, I said. I went broke and you went silent. My mom finally spoke, and her voice came out soft, practice soft, the kind that sounds loving if you don't listen closely. We gave you space, she said. You didn't give me space. I shot back. You gave me abandonment. And that's when Brandon chimed in because he couldn't help himself. He wanted to be the finishing blow. You always do this, he said. You always turn everything into a trauma speech. Trauma speech. Like pain is a hobby I picked up for attention. I turned to him and said, Did you know they try to take a mortgage in my name? He didn't answer at first, and that pause was loud. Then he said, Dad said it was temporary. Temporary fraud. Temporary theft. Temporary betrayal. That was the moment I realized the truth wasn't just my parents. Brandon was part of the machine. He wasn't just the golden child. He was the reason the machine kept running because everyone in this house was protecting his comfort like it was family tradition. I looked at the camera in my mind because I always do that when life gets surreal, and I want you watching this to answer me honestly. If your parents used your name for a loan, would you call that love or would you call it a crime? Because my family wanted me to call it love. They wanted me to smile and say thank you while they picked my pockets. And here's the part that will make your blood boil. My dad leaned forward and said, You owe us. Not we're sorry. Not we panicked. You owe us. He tapped his folder again. All those years we carried you, he said. Now it's your turn to carry us. That word, carry, made me see the whole relationship clearly, not parent-child, not family, employer-employee, like I was hired to be their safety net, and I didn't even get benefits. I pulled my phone out and opened a note I'd prepared, because I'm not walking into a lion's den without a plan anymore. Here's what's going to happen, I said, and I read it calmly. 1. You're going to remove Mom's number and email from anything attached to my identity. 2. You're going to put in writing that you will never apply for credit or housing using my information again. 3. You're going to return any funds moved from any account in my name. And 4. You're going to sign a statement acknowledging the unauthorized application so I can provide it to the lender as proof you were responsible. And if you don't, I will let the investigation continue. My dad's face changed, and if you've ever watched someone realize the person they controlled is no longer scared, you know that look, it's like rage and disbelief had a baby. You think you can threaten your own father, he said. This isn't a threat, I replied. This is a boundary with consequences. My mom's eyes filled with tears. But I've seen those tears before. Those are the don't expose us tears, not the we hurt you tears. Kara, she said, using my name like it was a lullaby, you're making this worse than it is. Worse than it is. like a mortgage application in my name is a misunderstanding. I leaned closer, and I lowered my voice, not because I was scared, but because I wanted every word to land. Mom, I said, I have been carrying this family on my back while you pretended I didn't exist, and the minute I stopped, you tried to steal my future. Brandon scoffed, but it sounded weaker now. Dad stood up, and when he stood, the room felt smaller because he uses his body like a weapon, like height equals truth. You walk out that door, he said, and don't bother coming back. And there it was, the oldest leash in the world, exile, the threat of losing family, as if family isn't supposed to be the place you're safest. I looked at him and said, You already left me first. You just didn't have the decency to say it out loud. Silence. My mom inhaled sharply like she'd been slapped, not because she felt guilty, because she hated hearing the truth spoken. Dad's hands clenched. Brandon stared at me, and for the first time, he looked unsure because when the scapegoat stops begging, the whole script collapses. I picked up my folder and I walked to the door, and my legs were steady even though my heart was pounding, and right as my hand touched the knob, my dad said something that made me pause, not because it scared me, but because it revealed the next layer of the lie. If you push this, he said, you'll find out why we had to do it. Had to. Like fraud was self-defense. I turned around and said, Why? And he hesitated, and that hesitation was the crack I needed, because in that crack you could see the real motive, and my dad finally said, Because Brandon's situation is worse than you think. And my stomach dropped because I knew exactly what worse meant in my family. It meant a secret they'd been hiding behind my paycheck. It meant a debt, an addiction, a legal problem, something that would shame them if it got out, something they decided was safer to dump on me than to face like adults. I walked out anyway, but I didn't drive home right away. I sat in my car and called Daniel and said, They're hiding something bigger. And he said, Of course they are. And then my phone lit up with a notification I hadn't expected, an email from a lender I'd never contacted, subject line, urgent, verification needed, and when I opened it, my blood ran cold because the application wasn't just a mortgage inquiry. It was active, it was moving, and the address attached to it wasn't my parents' house. It was an apartment complex across town, which meant they weren't just trying to survive, they were trying to relocate using my name, and I suddenly understood the real game they were playing. They weren't asking me to carry them, they were trying to replace me, and I had about one night to stop whatever Brandon had dragged them into before it became a debt that followed me for the next decade. I didn't even start the car at first because my hands were suddenly too heavy for the steering wheel, like my body understood before my mind did that this wasn't just my parents being messy, this was active damage in motion, and when you see your name on something you never signed, it feels like someone broke into your skin, not your house. And I sat there in that dim parking lot with the dashboard glow lighting up my face like an interrogation room while I reread that lender email word by word. Verifying address, verifying employment, verifying intent to occupy, and the phrase intent to occupy made my stomach flip because intent is the part that turns accidents into crimes. Intent is where the law stops caring about tears and starts caring about signatures. I called the number in the email, and I forced my voice to stay calm even though my pulse was sprinting, and the woman who answered sounded like she'd been answering angry calls all day, that polite corporate warmth that's actually a wall, and I said, Hi, I need to confirm if there is an active application in my name. And she asked for the last four of my social and my full address, and I gave it because at that moment I wasn't thinking about privacy, I was thinking about survival, and then she paused and said, Yes, ma'am, there is an application in progress, and my heart did that ugly little drop, and she started listing the details like she was reading off a grocery list. Submitted online, supporting documents uploaded, employment verified pending, borrower phone number on file, and I said, What phone number? And she read it out, and it was my mother's number. And there are moments where you don't feel betrayal like sadness, you feel it like nausea, like your body is rejecting someone you used to call home. I asked, What documents? And she said, driver's license image, pay stubs, bank statements. And I had to swallow because I didn't know what scared me more, that my mom had access to those things or that she had created them. And then I said the sentence that changed the temperature of the whole call. I did not submit that application, and the woman's voice shifted instantly, not warm anymore, procedural, and she said, "In that case, I need to transfer you to our fraud department." And the word fraud out loud made it real in a way my parents could never gaslight away, because in their house it's always misunderstanding and family business, but the outside world calls it what it is. The fraud guy came on, asked a million questions, and I answered all of them, and he told me to email a copy of my ID and a written statement and file a police report, and I know some people hate hearing that part because it's scary, but here's the moral lesson that nobody tells you until it's too late. Family is the most commonplace identity theft starts because people confuse access with permission, and if you don't treat it seriously, you end up paying for someone else's desperation with your future. I hung up and sat there staring at my phone, and I realized I had two choices, panic in the dark or move with purpose, and I chose purpose because panic has never paid a bill in my life. I opened my notes and started making a list like I was planning a heist against my own downfall. Call bank, freeze credit, check all 3 bureaus, notify landlord, secure documents, change passwords, and then I added one more line that felt like swallowing glass. Confront them at the address. Because that address wasn't random. They weren't applying for a mortgage to play pretend. They were trying to live somewhere under my name, and if they got keys, they'd have leverage, and leverage is their favorite food. I drove to the apartment complex across town, and it was one of those places that tries to look luxury with a stone sign and landscaping, but you can smell the cheap paint and new carpet from the parking lot, and the leasing office had a fake waterfall in the corner and a bowl of candy on the counter. And I walked in like I belonged there, because if you walk in scared, people treat you like a problem, and I said, "Hi, I'm Kara. I'm here about an application." And the leasing agent smiled and said, "Oh yes, you're scheduled to view the unit tomorrow." And my insides went cold because tomorrow meant the keys were close, and I said, "Actually, I need to talk to the manager. There's an issue with identity verification." And her smile slipped just slightly, and she went to the back. While I waited, I looked around and I saw a framed photo on the wall of smiling families by the pool and the gym and the dog park, and it hit me like a cruel joke that my parents were trying to move into a life they couldn't afford using the one person they'd already thrown away. The manager came out, older woman, sharp eyes, and she asked what the issue was, and I told her calmly that application was submitted without my authorization. And I watched her expression tighten into professional alarm, and she asked for my ID, and I handed it over, and she compared it to the file on her screen, and then she said, "The applicant uploaded a license image that matches your information." And I said, "Because it's my license or a copy of it." And she nodded slowly like she was putting pieces together. And then I asked the question I didn't want to ask, "Do you have a name for who has been communicating with you?" And she said, "The phone number on file is a woman named Lillian." And that was my mother's first name, and I swear to you my whole body went hot with anger, but my voice stayed level because losing control in front of professionals is how you lose credibility. I asked if anyone had come in person, and she said yes. A man had come by that morning on behalf of the applicant, and she described him, and it was my father, right down to the stiff posture and the just handling things vibe. And then she said something that made my skin crawl. He asked if we could expedite the move-in because of a family emergency, and I almost laughed because of course he did. My dad could sell a lie like it came with a warranty. I told her to flag the file, and she said they would cancel the application pending verification, and I thanked her, and as I turned to leave my phone buzzed with a text from Brandon, just one line, "Stop making this harder." And I stared at it like it was written in a different language, because imagine being the person who benefits from theft and calling the victim difficult. I texted back, "What are you hiding?" And he didn't reply, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. The secret wasn't my parents' idea. It was Brandon's gravity pulling them into something dumb and expensive. I drove straight to Daniel's place because I needed another adult in the room, not emotionally, strategically, and he met me at the door with that look that says he already knew this would escalate, and I told him everything in one breath: the lender, the leasing office, my mother's number, my father's visit, and Daniel did what good friends do. He didn't ask me if I was okay. He asked me what my next move was, and I said, "I'm going to their house tonight." And he said, "Not alone," and I wanted to argue because pride is my reflex, but then I remembered the other moral lesson: pride has gotten people hurt in situations like this, so I agreed. We drove there together, and the whole ride I kept replaying the last few months: how my parents cut me off when I lost my job, how they called it space, how my siblings followed the script like it was religion, and I realized the space wasn't kindness, it was punishment, it was training, it was them trying to teach me what happens when I stop being useful. We pulled up and the lights were on, and through the window I could see movement like they were packing, and that confirmed it. They weren't applying for fun. They were running from something, and when I knocked, my dad opened the door, and his face tightened when he saw Daniel behind me because bullies hate witnesses, and I said, "We need to talk now." And he tried the old move: "This isn't a good time." And I said, "It's a perfect time, because you used my name to apply for an apartment." And my mom appeared behind him like a ghost with lipstick, eyes wide, and she said, "Kara, please, not like this." And I stepped inside anyway, because I wasn't asking permission to protect myself. Brandon was sitting at the table, and there was a stack of envelopes in front of him. Red stamps, final notices, and when I saw those envelopes, my chest tightened because the picture snapped into focus. Debt. Urgent debt, the kind that makes people do criminal things and tell themselves it's temporary. I pointed at the stack and said, "What did you do?" And Brandon's mouth twitched like he wanted to deny it, but he didn't, and my dad said, "Watch your tone." And I turned on him so fast it felt like snapping a rope, and I said, "No, you watch your choices, because if you commit fraud in my name again, you're not dealing with family drama, you're dealing with charges." And my mom started crying immediately. Automatic, and she said, "We were going to fix it." And I said, "When, after I'm stuck with a lease and a ruined credit score." And then Brandon finally spoke, and his voice wasn't smug now, it was thin, scared, and he said, "It was supposed to be a short-term thing." And I laughed once, because every disaster starts as a short-term thing, and I said, "Tell me the whole truth." And my dad stepped forward like he was going to shut it down, and Daniel quietly moved closer behind me, not aggressive, just present, and my dad paused, and in that pause my mom whispered, barely audible, "He owes people." And my stomach turned again, because people is never just people. People means pressure. People means consequences that don't care about family titles. And I looked at Brandon and said, "Who?" And he swallowed and said, "Not who you think." And that made me colder than any name could, because it meant it was bad enough that he couldn't say it out loud. And then my mom said, "They came here," and my heart slammed and my dad snapped, "Stop," like shutting her up would undo the reality. And I realized right then the story I thought I was telling, the one where my parents were just selfish and my brother was just spoiled, had a deeper layer, one that explained the sudden urgency to move, the forged documents, the frantic family emergency lie. And I looked at the half-packed boxes by the hallway, and I understood they weren't relocating for comfort. They were trying to disappear while dragging my name behind them like a getaway car, and I asked the question that made all three of them freeze. "Did you already get keys to something under my name?" And my dad's eyes flicked to the counter, and I followed his gaze. And sitting there, face down like a secret, was a key fob with a tag from that exact apartment complex, and my body went ice cold because that meant they were closer than I thought, closer than the leasing manager told me, and it meant somebody in that office had been sloppy or bribed or rushed. And I picked up the key fob slowly and held it up and said, "So you lied, you applied, you verified, and you took possession." And my mom sobbed harder. Brandon looked like he might throw up, and my dad's face hardened into that stubborn pride he uses when he's guilty, and he said, "We did what we had to do." And I stared at him and said, "No, you did what was easiest for you, and then you tried to make me pay for it." And I slipped the key fob into my pocket because it was evidence now, not a tool, and I said, "You're going to sit down, all of you, and you're going to tell me exactly what Brandon owes, who came here, and what else you opened in my name, because if I find out from the bank instead of from your mouths, I'm not warning you again." And the room went so quiet I could hear the refrigerator hum, and I saw something I'd never seen before in my mother's face, not tears, fear, because she realized I wasn't the invisible one anymore. I was the one holding the light. And then Brandon whispered, "Okay," like he'd just stepped off a cliff, and he started to talk, and the first sentence out of his mouth made my blood run colder than the fraud ever did, because he said, "It started with an app, and then it wasn't just an app anymore. And then Dad promised he could handle it." And my dad flinched at that, and I realized the next reveal wasn't just about money. It was about how deep my father's control actually went, and who he'd been protecting this whole time, and what he'd been willing to sacrifice to keep the golden child shining. Brandon's voice was thin, like he was reading a confession off the inside of his skull, and the more he talked, the more I realized this wasn't one bad decision. It was a staircase of bad decisions, and every step had my parents' fingerprints on the railing because he started with, "It was just an app." And I said, "An app for what?" And he glanced at my dad before answering, which told me my dad had been coaching him. And then he muttered, "Sports betting at first." And my mom made a sound like she wanted to interrupt but didn't know which lie to choose, and then Brandon rushed. "It wasn't even real money at first," which is the kind of sentence people say right before they admit it became real money. And I leaned on the back of a chair without sitting because sitting felt like surrender, and I said, "Keep going." And he swallowed and said, "I got lucky a few times, and then I started chasing it." And chasing is the word that always shows up in these stories like a fingerprint in wet paint, because you're never just spending, you're trying to outrun shame. I looked at my dad, and he had his jaw set like he was bracing for a storm, and I said, "So you knew?" And my dad snapped, "Don't start pointing fingers." And I laughed once, short and sharp. "Sir, your finger is literally on the trigger. I'm just naming the gun." And Daniel shifted behind me, steady, quiet, like a security camera that breathes. Brandon kept talking. I fell behind, and then it wasn't just the app, it was people. And when he said people again, my stomach tightened because the word people is vague on purpose. It's the coward's way of saying danger without admitting they invited it in. And I said, "Who?" And he shook his head fast. "It doesn't matter." And I said, "It matters to me because they came to my parents' house, which means they can come to my job, my apartment, my life, so say it." And my mom started crying harder and said, "Kara, please," like the truth was a knife, and she wanted me to put it down for her comfort. And I said, "No, because you didn't say please when you used my name." And my dad took a step toward me and said, "Watch how you talk to your mother." And Daniel finally spoke, calm but firm. "She's talking to the people who committed fraud against her." And that sentence hit the room like a slap, because it stripped the family costumes off and left the facts standing there naked. My dad's face flashed with anger, and I saw it, that old habit of his, the way he tries to intimidate anyone who won't play along. And then Brandon blurted, "It was a private lender too," and I snapped my eyes back to him. "A lender?" And he nodded. "I took out a loan to cover the losses, then another to cover the first, and then Dad said we could refinance." And I felt my chest tighten because refinance is a grown-up word for digging deeper, and I said, "So this is why you needed an apartment." And Brandon nodded again, miserable. They were going to take the house, and my mom gasped like she was hearing it for the first time, which was hilarious because she had been packing boxes like she was escaping a fire, and I said, "Stop acting surprised. You're the one who told me. They came here. You knew." And she flinched, and my dad said, "We were trying to handle it quietly." And I looked straight at him and said, "Quietly is what guilty people call it when they don't want witnesses." Here's the thing you only learn when you've been the responsible child your whole life. Families like mine treat responsibility like a leash. They praise you when you pull and punish you when you stop. And right then I realized this was never about Brandon's debt alone. It was about my father's ego. Because my father cannot tolerate public failure, not even his sons. So he turned to the easiest solution, which was me, the invisible insurance policy. I said, "Tell me exactly what you did in my name." And my dad opened his mouth to answer for him, and I cut him off. "Not you, him." And Brandon's eyes filled like he hated himself. "They used your info for the apartment, and then Dad tried to open a credit card, and my mouth went dry. Tried, and he looked at the table and whispered, "It got approved," and my skin went cold again. And then my mom said in a small voice, "We were going to pay it." And I stared at her. "With what money? The pool you didn't build, the job I didn't have, the guilt you thought would print cash." And she sobbed, and I didn't feel sorry, not because I'm heartless, but because this is what manipulation looks like when it wears a mother's face. Tears as a smoke screen. I pulled my phone out and opened my banking app right there in their kitchen, because I needed to see if my accounts were still mine, and I watched my father's eyes track my screen like a predator watching prey, and that alone told me he'd been inside my finances before. I said, "How did you even get my documents?" And my dad said, "We raised you, we have your information." Like parenting was a legal contract to steal, and Daniel muttered, "That's not how any of this works." And my dad snapped, "Stay out of it." And I turned to my dad and said, "No, you stay out of me. You don't get to use I raised you as a skeleton key for my identity." And I reached into my pocket and put the key fob on the table with a click, and I said, "Explain this, because the leasing manager told me the application was getting canceled. So how do you already have a fob?" And my mom's crying paused like even her emotions needed to recalibrate, and Brandon stared at the fob like it was radioactive, and my dad didn't answer fast enough, which was the answer. And then my mom whispered, "Your father knows the assistant manager." And I felt a surge of disgust because of course my father had a connection. Families like mine don't just break rules, they recruit someone on the inside to make it feel legitimate. And I said, "So you pulled a favor to get keys under my name?" And my dad finally barked, "It was temporary." And I said, "Temporary is what you call it when you want me to be calm while you set my life on fire." And I looked at Brandon, "And you?" And he flinched. "You let them do it." And he said, "I didn't know it would go this far." And that's the most infuriating line in the world, because it always goes that far. It always expands until it hits the one person who keeps saying yes. I took a breath and forced my voice steady. "Here's what's going to happen." And my dad scoffed like he still thought he had authority, and I kept going, "I'm freezing my credit tonight. I'm filing a police report tonight, and tomorrow morning I'm calling the leasing office again and giving them the fraud report number and the key fob serial if they need it. And if anybody opens anything else in my name, I will not hesitate, because you already crossed the line people swear they'd never cross." And my mom cried, "You'd really do that to us?" And I looked at her and said, "You already did it to me." And that silence that followed was the first honest thing in that house. Now let me ask you something real quick, because I know somebody watching right now is already in this exact situation. Would you protect your parents from consequences if they were willing to ruin your future to save their image? Or would you choose yourself for once? And don't give me the polite answer. Give me the honest one, because politeness is how people like my parents survive. My dad tried a new tactic then, softer. "Kara, we can fix this without making it a big thing." And I said, "You mean without anyone finding out?" And he said, "Without destroying the family." And I laughed, but it wasn't funny. "Sir, the family has been destroying me quietly for years. I'm just refusing to be the landfill anymore." And Brandon finally looked up at me and said, "What do you want?" And I said, "The truth in full." And then Daniel added, "And repayment." And my dad glared at him. But he didn't object because he knew. So Brandon started listing numbers, amounts, due dates. The kind of details that make a situation stop feeling like drama and start feeling like a disaster. And my mom sat down like her legs gave out because she was finally confronting what she helped build. And Brandon said, "They're coming back Friday." And my heart thumped. And he nodded, "They want a payment." And my dad said, "We'll handle it." And I snapped. "You handled it into my name." And Brandon whispered, "If we don't pay, they'll—" And he trailed off, and my mother covered her mouth, and the air in the kitchen turned thick. And that's when I realized the next move wasn't just legal, it was safety, because if strangers were showing up to collect, then this wasn't just about credit and paperwork, it was about physical risk, and my parents had dragged me into that without my consent. I looked at the front door, then back at them, and I said, "Give me every document you used." And my dad said, "We don't have them." And I stepped closer, voice low, "Don't lie again." And my mom pointed shakily toward the hallway closet, and I walked over and opened it, and behind the coats and the vacuum was a folder, thick, stuffed, my name on sticky notes, my old address, copies of my ID, printouts. And right on top was a pre-approval letter with my name and a loan amount that made my vision blur, and I stood there holding it, feeling my whole life tilt, because this wasn't just an apartment. This was them trying to tie me to a mortgage, a long-term chain, and I turned back to them and said, "You weren't escaping, you were moving into my skin." And my dad's face hardened and he said, "You owe this family." And I smiled, slow, dangerous. "No, I paid this family for years, with money, with silence, with my dignity." And I walked back to the table, dropped the folder down, and said, "And now you're going to tell me one more thing." And my dad sneered, "What?" And I held up the pre-approval letter and asked, "Whose name is on the deed of this house right now?" Because the way my father's eyes flicked away told me there was a second secret hiding under the first, and when my mom whispered, "Your grandfather's trust," my stomach dropped, because suddenly I understood why my father was so frantic to keep this quiet, and why he was willing to forge, bribe, and steal. And why Brandon looked like he was drowning, because if the house wasn't even theirs the way they pretended, then the next consequence wasn't just debt collectors, it was legal eviction, exposure, public humiliation, and my father losing the one thing he worshipped more than money, control. And right as I processed that, my phone buzzed with a blocked number calling, and I stared at the screen while my parents stared at me. And I knew before I answered that whoever was on the other end wasn't calling to apologize. The blocked number kept buzzing like a wasp trapped in a jar, and everyone in that kitchen stared at my phone like it was a live grenade. And I didn't answer on the first ring because I wanted them to feel it. I wanted my parents to taste what they'd served me for years. That stomach drop moment where you realize you're not in control. And then I swiped to answer and held it up to my ear and said, "Hello," and a man's voice came through calm. Too calm, the kind of calm that isn't peace, it's practice, and he said, "Is this Kara Mensa?" And my father's shoulders tightened at my name like it physically hurt him to hear it attached to consequences, and I said, "Speaking," and the man said, "We need to finalize the arrangement your family started." And I didn't say family, I didn't say parents, I said, "Who are you?" And he chuckled like I was cute, like I was naive, like the world owed him obedience, and he said, "You know who we are." And I looked at Brandon and his face went gray, and in that moment I understood something with a clarity that made me cold. My parents didn't just commit fraud, they invited wolves to the front door, and assumed I'd be the one to stand there and smile. I said, "You have the wrong number." And he replied instantly, "No, we don't." And then he read out the address of that new apartment, the one I hadn't even moved into, the one my parents had keys to, and my stomach flipped because it meant the leasing office wasn't just sloppy, it was compromised. And then he added, "We'll see you Friday," like it was a lunch date, and I said, "Don't call me again." And he laughed. And then the line went dead. Silence flooded the kitchen, thick and heavy, and I could hear the refrigerator hum like it was the only sane thing in the room, and my mom whispered, "Kara," like she wanted to pull the word back into her mouth, and I said, "No." And it came out flat, not dramatic, just done. And I turned to my dad and said, "You brought strangers into my life." And he tried to square his shoulders like he could posture his way out of reality. "They're not strangers, it's an arrangement." And Daniel cut in. "That's extortion with extra steps." And my dad snapped, "You don't know anything." And Daniel answered calmly, "I know enough to tell her to leave right now." And I did. I grabbed the folder. I grabbed the key fob, and I walked to the door, and my mom lunged after me, grabbing my wrist, nails digging in just enough to remind me she still thought she owned me, and she hissed, "If you do this, you'll destroy us." And I turned and looked her straight in the eye and said, "You destroyed you. I'm just not carrying you anymore." And I peeled her hand off my arm one finger at a time, slow and deliberate, so she'd feel the boundary like a locked door. In the car, Daniel didn't ask me a bunch of soft questions. He just said, "We go to the police station first, then we freeze your credit, then we call the property manager from the parking lot so everything is documented." And I nodded because my brain had clicked into that survival mode where you stop feeling and start executing. And while we drove, my phone lit up with messages like a slot machine. My mom, my dad, Brandon, even my auntie and a cousin I hadn't heard from in months, all suddenly alive, all suddenly concerned. And it would have been funny if it wasn't so predictable, because silence is their favorite weapon until you pick up a weapon of your own. Then they call it disrespect. At the station, the fluorescent lights made everyone look guilty, even the posters on the wall. And when I told the desk officer what happened, I expected that skeptical face people give when you say identity theft and family in the same sentence, but the officer's expression didn't change. He just nodded like he'd heard this story too many times, and he said, "Do you have proof?" And I slid the folder across the counter. Copies of my ID, the credit card approval, the pre-approval letter, the key fob, and his eyebrows lifted at that, and he said, "A fob already issued under your name." And I said, "Yes, and my parents have it." And he exhaled slowly. "Okay." And that one word felt like oxygen because it wasn't pity, it was process, it was action, it was the system acknowledging I wasn't crazy. Then came the part that makes people panic but honestly made me feel powerful. The report number, the official documentation, because when manipulation thrives on private shame, paperwork is sunlight. And I took that report number and called the credit bureaus for my car, froze everything, placed alerts, and while I was on hold listening to that awful music, I looked at Daniel and said, "I feel like I'm watching my life from outside." And he said, "Good, because the outside version makes better decisions." And I laughed once, breathless, because it was the first time I'd laughed all day, and it sounded like a crack in a wall that had been holding back a flood. Then we called the leasing office, and this time I didn't beg. I didn't explain like I needed permission to be protected. I stated facts like I was reading charges. "This application is fraudulent. I have a police report number. I need the file flagged. I need the keys deactivated. And I need the name of anyone who accessed or approved the application." And the woman on the phone tried to do that corporate soothing voice. "Ma'am, I understand." And I said, "No, you don't, and I'm not here for comfort, I'm here for compliance." And Daniel nodded like proud isn't the right word, but relieved is. Because this is what most people don't realize. The moment you stop performing calm for the people who hurt you, you become dangerous in the best way. Within an hour, I got an email confirming the application was halted and the access was being reviewed, and I stared at that email like it was a winning lottery ticket because it meant one door was closed, one trap disarmed, one piece of my future pulled out of their hands. But the bigger trap was still sitting there, heavier than all the rest, that pre-approval letter, because it wasn't about debt anymore. It was about my identity becoming their escape hatch. And I knew if they were desperate enough to try a mortgage in my name, they were desperate enough to try anything. And that's when I did something I never thought I'd do. I called my grandfather's attorney. The one name my mom hated hearing because it meant accountability, and when the receptionist said, "He can speak with you tomorrow," I said, "No, today," and I heard my own voice, steady, not rude, just immovable, and within minutes I was on the phone with a man who spoke like he measured words for a living, and I told him the truth, and he went quiet, and then he said, "Kara, I'm glad you called." And my heart thudded because nobody says that unless there's more. He asked one question that made the room tilt again. "Has your father ever asked you to sign anything for convenience?" And I immediately thought of every holiday, every family gathering where papers appeared casually like napkins, and I felt sick, and I said, "There were documents I refused to sign a few years ago." And he replied, "That was wise." And then he said the sentence that changed my posture. "The house is not in your parents' names, and it has not been for a long time." And I whispered, "So why were they acting like it was theirs?" And he said, "Because acting is free." And I laughed, but it came out sharp, because that's exactly it. My parents have always lived like they could rewrite reality by repeating a story loud enough. He told me there was a trust, and that my grandfather had placed conditions because he didn't trust my parents' decisions, and I sat there with my mouth slightly open because it's wild how your whole childhood can be shaped by people who are never truly in control, just loud. And then the attorney said, "I can't discuss beneficiaries in detail without verifying some things, but I can tell you this. You are not as powerless as they've made you feel." And that sentence hit me right in the ribs. Because powerlessness was the brand my parents stamped on me since forever, and I suddenly saw the pattern like a map. The golden child who could fail endlessly, the scapegoat who had to earn basic love, the parents who treated boundaries like betrayal, and me, the walking bank account and emotional trash bin who finally stopped volunteering. That night, my parents showed up at my door because of course they did, because people like that don't knock, they arrive, they invade, they assume access, and when I looked through the peephole and saw my mom's face tight with rage and panic and my dad's jaw set like a judge, I felt my stomach flutter. Not fear, not really, more like old conditioning trying to wake up, and Daniel stood behind me and said, "You don't have to open it." And I said, "I know." And I didn't open it, I spoke through the door. "Go home." And my mom's voice rose. "Open this door. We need to talk." And I said, "You needed to talk before you used my name." And my dad snapped, "Don't be dramatic." And I laughed softly. Dramatic is forging your daughter's identity and expecting applause. And my mom switched tactics fast. Tears on demand. "We're your parents." And I said, "Parents protect. You recruited collectors." And then my dad said the one thing he thought would crack me. "If you don't help us, you'll be the reason Brandon ends up ruined." And I felt a strange calm settle over me, because there it was, the final card, the guilt grenade. And I said, "No, he will be ruined by his choices and your enabling, and the best thing I can do for him now is stop rescuing him." And there was a pause, and then my mom hissed, "After everything we did for you." And I said, "Tell the truth. You did things for you and I paid." And then I added, "And I'm done." They stood there a moment longer, like they were waiting for my childhood self to come crawling back. And when it didn't happen, my dad said quietly, "You're choosing a man over family." And I smiled at the audacity. "No, I'm choosing reality over manipulation." And then I said the line that finally made them go quiet. "If you come back again, I'll add harassment to the report." And I heard my mom gasp like consequences were profanity, and then their footsteps retreated down the hallway, and I leaned my forehead against the door and exhaled, and it felt like stepping out of a room I'd been holding my breath in for years. Now I want you to tell me something, because I know this comment section is going to turn into a courtroom. If your parents committed fraud in your name, would you protect them because they gave birth to you? Or would you protect your future because you have to live in it? And don't give me "it depends." Give me what you'd actually do when the block number calls and the keys are already cut. The next morning, I met with the attorney in person, and he placed a file on the table, thick, organized, and it hit me how my parents' chaos had always been sloppy and loud, while my grandfather's protection was quiet and precise. and as I flipped through the pages, I realized my family's biggest mistake wasn't underestimating my kindness, it was underestimating my grandfather's foresight. Because he'd built a firewall years before I even knew I'd need one, and when the attorney looked at me and said, "There are steps we can take today," I felt something in my chest lift. Not revenge, not cruelty, just relief, because the story was no longer them doing things to me. It was me choosing what happens next. And as I walked out of that office into the sun, phone buzzing again with messages I didn't open, I finally understood the real twist in this whole mess. The moment they cut me off wasn't the moment I lost everything. It was the moment they lost control. And if you think what I found in that trust file was shocking, you're not ready for what I uncovered next, because the fraud wasn't the only thing my parents had been hiding, and the next story I'm dropping is the one that explains why they were so desperate to put my name on a mortgage in the first place. So if you want the real blueprint of how family turns into a scam and how to protect yourself before it happens to you, click the next video, because I'm walking you through the exact steps I took, what I wish I did sooner, and the part my parents never expected me to learn.